Good morning. That's what it is here. And it's a beautiful day. It's already 61 degrees outside and it's February. So we didn't have much of a winter, did we? Most of it was quite light. Okay, so today we're going to discuss a story in John about a healing on the Sabbath. A healing on the Sabbath. So we're going to go back to the Old Testament, to Exodus, to see why this was so upsetting to the Pharisees. Now, they had no right to be upset about it, but they were protecting, so they thought, the Sabbath law. And the Sabbath was a part of God's covenant with his people. And let me explain that. Um, when the children of Israel got to Sinai, God came and through Moses and his voice and said, "Will you obey me?" And the people replied, "We will obey. We will obey." And part of that was when God gave the Ten Commandments, one of which was, um, honoring, keeping the Sabbath day. And they said, "We will obey." And then there was a covenant made in which some of the children of Israel, the prominent men, went up the mountain. And in order to solidify that covenant, they had a meal in the presence of God. And when they came down, the covenant was made. The people had promised. Now, this covenant throughout Scripture, in the Old Testament, was considered a marriage covenant. That is why God could say of his people, when they went after other gods, Baal and Marduk and others, God could say, "You have committed adultery against me. You have committed whoredom against me." The whole book of Hosea is about the marriage covenant between God and the children of Israel, and that they have prostituted themselves with other gods. So when we get to the Sabbath, which is a part of that covenant, it's written in such a way that the children of Israel would easily be able to memorize it. Remember, they don't have a book. I must have a dozen different kinds of Bibles in my home, and but they had nothing. It was, yes, written down on a scroll or the clay tablets, but the individual did not have a copy of their own Bible. So the thing to do was to memorize it. And this covenant was so important that it's written chiastically. Now, for some of you who don't know what a chiasm is, that's a technique that the author uses to draw attention to what is written and to make it easier to memorize. So we're going to look at that chiasm today, as well as the rule of the Sabbath keeping and the purpose for it and the reason why uh, that the Sabbath was to be kept. So you got your first page, which says Sabbath, and it says Exodus 31. And we're going to read through it. And as we read through it, you're going to circle the number of times Sabbath is used. So circle it, and maybe as you go along, you'll figure out the number without even counting. We'll see. Now Yahweh said to Moshe, which is the Hebrew way of saying Moses, and by the way, this is a translation by Everett Fox, and what he has done is strive to keep the wording of the English in the same order as the wording in the Hebrew, and use the same repeated word so that when we read it, it will sound a little archaic, a little, like you almost stumble over the words because it's not the way we would normally read it. But I like it because it's copying very well the Hebrew into English. Now Yahweh said to Moshe, "And you speak to the children of Israel." Now are certain times when I am going to emphasize some words or phrases. And I want you to see that Moshe is told by Yahweh to speak to the children of Israel, saying, however, my Sabbaths, and notice that it's plural because there isn't just one Sabbath. There isn't just one Sabbath like the seventh day Sabbath. There's a 7-year Sabbath and a seventh 7-year Sabbath, which the next year they celebrate as the year of Jubilee, celebrating 7 sevens. My Sabbaths you are to keep, for it is a sign between me, Yahweh, and you. Who's the you referred to? The children of Israel. Throughout your generations, to know that I, Yahweh, hallow you, set you apart. You are to keep the Sabbath, for it is holiness for you. Whoever profanes it is to be put to death. Yes, death. See how he uses the same word twice? That's the way it is in the Hebrew. Death, death. To emphasize that word. We could translate it, you will surely die. For whoever makes work on it, that person is to be cut off from among his kinspeople. For 6 days is work to be made, but on the 7th day, Sabbath, there it is repeated. We wouldn't do that in the English. It would look like a typo, wouldn't it? But it is in the Hebrew because they're emphasizing Sabbath, Sabbath ceasing, holiness for Yahweh. Whoever makes work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. Yes, death, or death. The children of Israel are to keep the Sabbath, to make the Sabbath observance throughout their generation as a covenant. Remember, marriage covenant for the ages between me and the children of Israel. A sign it is for the ages. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, but on the 7th day he ceased and paused for breath. So we're now being told at the very end why they must keep the Sabbath, and it's because God kept the Sabbath first. He rested on the 7th day. Now, of course, the Jews knew that rest on the 7th day, kept by Yahweh, did not discount the fact that Yahweh kept everything, the universe, in control. He kept it up. So let's go back to what we see. Did you count the number of Sabbaths? 7. Why do you think he chose 7 times to say Sabbath? Well, it's because the Sabbath is on the 7th day. Now, you need to remember that. The Sabbath is on the 7th day to commemorate the fact that God rested on the 7th day in this creation week. And so the covenant was between Yahweh and his people, and it was a marriage covenant. And it says, um, and now Yahweh said to Moshe, "You are to speak to the children of Israel." Are you noting that I'm repeating that? It's for the children of Israel. It's a covenant between them, and it's under the old covenant. And notice that there are more than one Sabbath. So if you are going to keep the Sabbath today, you'd have to keep the other Sabbaths because that's in the Sabbath observance. That would mean you'd forgive all loans in the 7th year that people owed you. You would let, if you were a farmer, the land lie fallow for that 7th year. It's a year of rest even for the land. All loans, everything is released, forgiven on that Sabbath. I don't think that that would work at your bank. Do you? Even if it was owned by Jewish people? No, it doesn't work. So you're to keep all the Sabbaths. That's what it says right up there, Sabbaths. And the Sabbath is a sign of this covenant, this marriage covenant. Now, what is the sign for us that we are married? What is the sign for a husband and for a wife? Yes, hopefully you're looking at my hands. It's that ring, isn't it? And he says that the Sabbath was the sign of the covenant. Now, why was it a sign of the covenant? Because no other nation had a Sabbath. All other nations, except for certain and very few holy days, had 7-day work weeks. There was no rest day. Like I said, only for certain holy days that some people had. But the children of Israel was given this wonderful gift. It was a freeing gift. You could rest on the Sabbath day. You could stop that heavy-duty work on the Sabbath day. This was good for the body. And it was also good because it was the sign that you were keeping God's covenant. Now, let's just say a wife or a husband on a business trip took their wedding band off and put it in their pocket. What kind of sign would that be? Well, it would mean that the husband or wife was saying, "I'm available." Yes. And that's what happened with the children of Israel. When they stopped their Sabbath, they were going to the Baals and worshiping the Baals and no longer keeping the Sabbath day. This was a breaking of the covenant, a taking the ring, the wedding band, off. And this hurt God so terribly. He talked about it as though Israel was his wife, because she was, and that she was committing adultery as she was. And this hurt Yahweh tremendously. And he tells Israel this over and over again throughout the prophets, particularly Hosea, but in all the prophets. This pain. Now you know yourself that it's unimaginable, the pain of having your mate, your spouse, commit adultery against you, the pain that you would feel. God feels that pain. And in fact, it tells us in the Hebrew, just before the Lord sent a flood, that the wickedness that mankind was doing was hurting his heart. Can you imagine that? I don't want to hurt God's heart with what I do. And yet people were hurting God's heart. And the children of God, when they went after the Baals, they were hurting God's heart. So we have this day of rest. The seventh day is the day of rest. And it is a sign. For whom? For the children of Israel. So that we don't have the Sabbath. We're under the new covenant, aren't we? And not once does the New Testament say that we had, as the church, have to do the Sabbath. That, in fact, of the 10 Commandments, 9 of those 10 Commandments are repeated for the church in the New Testament. Don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't kill. All of them, except for that one commandment, the Sabbath. It never tells us that the church must keep the Sabbath. We have a different day where we get together, and that's the first day of the week. Whereas the Sabbath was the seventh day of the week. We have the first day of the week, and that's called the Lord's Day. We no longer have to keep the Sabbath. And that's what Paul tells us in Colossians 2:16 and 17. Let me read it for you. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you. Don't let anybody judge you on questions of food or drink, what you eat or drink, or with regard to the feasts or new moons, which is a part of the Old Covenant. And then he says, Sabbath. Don't let anybody judge you. You don't keep the feasts. You don't keep the new moons. You don't keep the Sabbath. Why? Because these things, the feasts and the new moons and the Sabbath, are a shadow of the things to come. Or in other words, they were types. They foreshadowed what? Christ. And that's what it says. They are a shadow of things to come. But the real thing, the reality, the substance belongs to Christ. So, okay. So, now, you can see that the Sabbath was important to the Jewish leaders. The problem is they put a straitjacket around the Sabbath. They took all the joy away. They took all the peace away because you were always worried about those 100 and so rules that they put around the Sabbath. Rules such as how many steps you could walk on the Sabbath. You had to count how far you were going on the Sabbath because you could not go past this certain amount of steps, or you couldn't carry anything. You couldn't heal anybody. That's what was going on. Loads and loads of restrictions for the Sabbath that were not a part of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant said the Sabbath was for you, for a day of rest. Now we can keep up that day of rest. And in fact, many people do on the first day of the week because God did it. It's a good idea to rest for a day and to make sure we're putting God first on that day. But it is not a part of our covenant, the new covenant. It is just something that we can do. Um, so let's read the story in play form, John 5 1 to 18. And we're going to read it 5 1 to 18. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades or columns. In these lay a multitude of invalids, the blind, the lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he spoke to him. Now, throughout the book of John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem on many of their feasts, probably, definitely the 3 feasts he's supposed to go there for. And John records that he goes often to Jerusalem. Now, the reason is that he wants to show Jesus as a fulfillment of these feasts. Not only that, but Jesus uses these feasts to describe who he is. He's the light of the world, just as the Feast of Hanukkah shows. And so he uses the feast as a springboard for teaching us about Jesus himself. But if you go to the other 3 Gospels, how many times does Jesus go to Jerusalem in the other 3 Gospels? Every single other Gospel records only one time when Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And do you know when that is? When he's going to Jerusalem, that special week before and during and after Jesus' crucifixion. It's as though they are deciding that they're not going to record the other times when Jesus is there because they want it to be the climax of the whole story. The crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension is the climax of that story. And so they put aside the other times when Jesus goes to Jerusalem so that you zero in on that one time, that special time. That John also includes that last time, you know that. But John also, for his purpose, he's doing it purposefully, recording the other times purposefully, because he has an agenda. He knows what he wants to get across about Jesus. The other gospel writers don't have John's agenda. They have the agenda the Holy Spirit gave to them. Okay, so Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man says, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Now, this pool was like a lot of pools in other parts of the world that had special bubbling elements to it, where the people in the other nations used those pools as a place of a mystical healing. People would go to that pool and get in that pool, and they could be healed. And that's what this man believed. It was a pagan belief found in other nations, and it was not a part of God's belief. You can know that, the belief in Yahweh, you can know that because um, Jesus never says, go down to the pool, does he? No, he's going to heal the man outside the pool, isn't he? Yes, well, let's watch that happen. Because this man believes a well timed entry into the pool will guarantee his healing, and Jesus has to dispel that belief and take that belief so that he would believe in Jesus. Jesus says, get up, take up your bed, and walk. Now, watch what happens. This man's, at once, the man was healed. And he thanked Jesus profusely. No, that's not there, is it? And he took up his bed and walked. Just walked away. Just walked away. So he knows nothing about Jesus. He asks no questions about Jesus. He doesn't even know that it was Jesus who did it for him. Unlike the Samaritan woman who asked questions of Jesus and then believed, and the official who asked Jesus to come heal his son and then believed what Jesus had to say and did what Jesus had to say and went home just at Jesus's word. This man, in the previous two stories, they believed. It tells us that they believed, but there's not a sign of belief in this whole story of this man. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews spoke to the man who had been healed. Now this is the first mention of Sabbath in John's book, and it introduces us to a major theme in John, which is that the people thought of Jesus as a Sabbath breaker rather than as a healer. That was the religious leaders who thought, they didn't even consider the fact that he had healed this man who had been lame for 38 years. They only considered him a Sabbath breaker. And the man knew it because the Jews tell him, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. What did the religious leaders overlook? They overlooked the fact that the man had been healed. It was this Sabbath. And the sixth man who, it says, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. It's his fault. The oral tradition of Sabbath was so painstakingly spelled out in the Mishnah. What could and could not be done on the Sabbath. And that's why their rules around the Sabbath, straitjacket around the Sabbath, fence around the Sabbath, was keeping them from seeing that the man was healed by Jesus. The Jews said, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? And the sick man says, now the man who had been, the narrator says, now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and spoke to him. And look what Jesus says. See, you are healed. Now watch this. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now we know that Jesus has said, and will say again, that it's not always because a person has sinned that they have something that has caused them and has caused an infirmity in their body. But in this case, Jesus comes to him not only to heal him physically, but to heal him spiritually. And he confronts the man and he says these words, "Do not continue to sin." That's what it says in the Greek. That word, sin no more, that word sin is continuous sin. Don't continue to sin. Making us realize that it was that sin, whatever it was, that caused his lameness. And Jesus says, stop that sinning, because that nothing worse may happen to you. What's he talking about? There's something worse that could happen to him. Judgment. So he's confronting the man with his sin. And like so much of the world who hates the Christian because they feel that the Christian is pointing their finger at them, they hate the Christian just like what's going to happen here. Because as soon as Jesus sees this, he's in the temple already. The man went away and told the Jews. That's what right after Jesus confronts him with his sin, rather than repenting and believing in Jesus as the Samaritan woman believed in Jesus, and the royal official believed in Jesus, this man, he does not want to believe in Jesus, does he? In fact, he wants to throw Jesus under the bus, doesn't he? The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him. The man knows that the Jews are angry at Jesus. They had said, this man shouldn't have healed on the Sabbath, right? But he still goes to them, doesn't he? Perhaps out of spite at Jesus' reprimand, the man throws Jesus under the bus. The man's report to the Jewish authority then sets up persecution of Jews. Watch this. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. So one thing leads to the other. Jesus confronts the man with his sin, so that the man will repent and believe in Jesus. The man doesn't. He goes immediately to the Jews, the authorities, and then the authorities immediately set out to persecute Jesus because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answers them. My Father is working until now, and I am working. Oh, what does that mean? Well, the narrator tells us. Now, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, which they were angry at already, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, what was it that caused you to realize that this story tells us that we should view this man negatively? Before coming to this, I had just been frustrated with this man, angry with this man. What is he, stupid or something? Not realizing that the author, John, is trying to get across certain points about this man. That even though he was healed, like everybody's clamoring and coming to Jesus and believing in Jesus because of his signs, this man who has a sign worked on himself, given to him, this man does not believe at all. So there are three we must evaluate the man negatively on 3 points. One, and that's on this page, the next page. You see it? In the end, the man appears to side with the Jews, doesn't he? Reporting Jesus as the Sabbath breaker. He has the characteristics of a traitor, a Judas, doesn't he? Second point, for John, an adequate belief response and evidence of discipleship are necessary characteristics of salvation. But he fails to witness, this man fails to witness to the Jews like the official a witness to his family, the Samaritan woman, a witness to her townspeople. He fails to do that, doesn't he? Nor is there a belief response. No word of belief in the whole story. But there was belief in the Samaritan woman's story, and the royal official believed and did what Jesus said. This man, this former lame man, is not able to receive the spiritual healing that Jesus offers. Jesus confronts him with his sin, and the man just walks away. And in a complete unbelief, tattletales on Jesus. Third, the lame man represents those whom even the signs cannot lead to authentic faith. Just as we've seen before, authentic faith is not just believing in Jesus' signs. There must be authentic faith that produces a disciple, just as Samaritan woman became a disciple and the official became a disciple, a believer in Jesus who truly believed. Okay, so just want to show you something more. As soon as I do this, let's see if we have it. Let's see. Excuse me. Okay. We are going to look at this story again to show John's reason for healing, a reason for Jesus healing on the Sabbath. John wants to tell us why Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And then Luke gives us his purpose for Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And Matthew gives us his purpose for healing on the Sabbath. So let's read what John has to say. And that's these three columns. John says in 5:16 to 18, in the healing of the lame man. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. What is the reason Jesus gives in John for healing on the Sabbath? He's working like his Father to demonstrate that he was God, the Father. God, the Son. So that's John's purpose, to get across that element, that Jesus did what the Father did, and therefore was equal with the Father. Luke's purpose, healing the withered man. And Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Come." and stand here." And he rose and stood there, and Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them, all he said to him, after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. What is the reason why Jesus gives in Luke for healing on the Sabbath? To do good. That's what it says. To do good, not harm. And in both cases, John's book and Luke's book, this stirs the religious leaders to hatred and anger and a decision to persecute Jesus. And in Matthew, which is another narrative about this same person, Matthew adds a little bit extra. Jesus went on from there and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep?" Now that part was recorded by Matthew, and it wasn't recorded by Luke. But that's okay. Each had a purpose. So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The same thing that is said in Luke, right? Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. In each case, it caused the religious leaders to want to destroy Jesus. In each case, there was a reason given for healing on the Sabbath. According to Luke and Matthew, they have their own purpose for bringing out that Jesus did it to show that you could do good on the Sabbath. In John's miracle, a different one, he brings out the fact that the healing was on the Sabbath so that Jesus could demonstrate that he was working like the Father. In other words, he was demonstrating that he was God. So, okay, well, this was wonderful to have you with me today, and I'm enjoying the response and seeing that you guys are continuing to study with me. Goodbye to next week, God willing.